My name is Father Paul Patrick. Welcome to Luminous program on Shalom World TV. I'll just begin reading. First reading, a reading from the second book of Kings. One day Elisha was passing through Shunem, where a wealthy woman lived, who urged him to have a meal. So whenever he passed that way, he would stop there for a meal. She said to her husband, "Look, I am sure that this man who regularly passes our way is a holy man of God. Let us make a small roof chamber with walls and put there for him a bed, a table, and a chair and a lamp, so that he can stay there whenever he comes to us." One day when Elisha came there, he went up to the chamber and lay down there. He said to his servant Gehazi, "What then may be done for the woman?" Gehazi answered, "Well, she has no son and her husband is old." Elisha said, "Call her." When the servant had called her, she stood at the door. Elisha said, "At this season, in due time, you shall embrace a son." We see that in verse 10, this woman and her wife, just to recap, they see this man passing by, Elisha, a prophet, and they go to all the trouble to make a special rooftop chamber for him. What do they do? Basically what it means is that they added an addition onto their house. So not just invite him into their house, but they made it permanent. So basically they built an addition on top of their house so that anytime the prophet comes, it's like his own house. He can go and sleep there, rest there. And I think that it's probably a good idea to spend a moment examining what is our attitude to rest. Quite oftentimes I would say that as Christians, we kind of look at rest maybe in, I would say probably even a negative kind of way. We look at someone taking a little bit of rest or something like that, especially a holy person, a prophet, would say, well, why does a holy man, why does a prophet even need to rest? He should be 24/7 without rest on the road doing the Lord's work. And we kind of, let's say, apply that also to ourselves as well, to our own lives. And when we look at rest, sometimes from a Christian perspective, we mistakenly think that rest equals laziness. Now, let's be clear from the beginning, we're not talking about laziness. Laziness is something totally different. But we're talking here about rest. We spend so much time, energy, taking care of machines in our lives. And rightly so. We put a lot of money into them. We put a lot of effort, resources into our machines. But oftentimes, we spend more effort and more resources taking care of machines than we do our own bodies. And that's why I think it's probably a good idea, especially as the summer season draws close, to step back a little bit, pause for a moment, and ask ourselves, what is my attitude towards rest? Just very briefly, if we look back to the first reading, we know that the people of that time had actually quite an interesting approach towards rest. Their concept of rest was one called Sabbath rest. Sabbath rest. We've all heard the commandment, remember to keep holy the Sabbath. Well, the people of God in the Old Testament, they took this commandment quite seriously. In fact, very, very seriously. You could almost say that they made an art out of resting, or rather a science, if you will, out of resting. What does it mean? Well, to the people of Israel, they had this kind of formula all worked out. And it's actually kind of interesting. I'll share it with you. They had this formula, and it was kind of like, you work for 6 days. You work hard for 6 days, and on the 7th day, you enjoy 1 day of rest, 1 day of sabbatical, if you will. You work for 6 years. You work for 6 years, and then on the 7th year, you enjoy a sabbatical year, a year of rest. The community works for 49 years, so the entire community for 49 years, and then on the 50th year, they have a jubilee year. And then finally, you spend you spend a lifetime working, and you spend an eternity of sabbatical of rest with God. So there's this kind of idea of working hard and then enjoying your sabbatical rest, which ultimately ties into spending eternity with God. And kind of that begs the question for all of us today. In today's modern world, we're far removed from this concept, let's say over 2,000 years ago. However, it's good to kind of step back a little bit and ask ourselves, what is precisely my attitude towards rest, and how do I continue, or how do I hold this tradition of Sabbath rest in my life? We know that probably our current generation is one of the most busy and productive generations of all time. Oftentimes, if I go into a school, talking with young people, I'll kind of ask them, I'll say, well, guys, how did your day go? And they'll often tell me, oh, it was terrible. Why? Well, because I didn't get anything done. Because unfortunately, in our society, we're so geared to production that if I didn't get anything productive done, it means that I had a terrible day. Just kind of, let's say, taking a little bit different approach. God would kind of, in a certain sense, ask us something different. He would say, how was today spent body, mind, and soul? See, oftentimes as Christians, we forget that God has created us with a soul and a body to work together in tandem. Case in point, how charitable do you feel when, for example, you've spent the entire day with a migraine headache? Someone comes to your door and asks you for a favor. What is your first response? First response is probably, go away, I feel terrible. Take that scenario again when you're feeling wonderful, when you've been well rested, someone comes to your door, they ask you for charity, and you throw open your arms, you say, oh, of course, I'm at your service. You see, body-soul connection is actually far more involved than we would care to admit. And so that kind of begs the question, precisely, in my life, how do I go about creating this atmosphere in which I have at least one day rest a week? I would kind of say two quick points. First point is that we actually need to realize that we are worthy of having rest. Oftentimes if I talk to people and I say, when was the last time you had a rest? Because they're kind of complaining about how they're so tired and burnt out and so on and so forth, and how they're working 7 days a week and bringing their kids here and there and everything and so on and so forth. And I say, well, when was the last time you actually rested? Well, Father, I don't have time to rest. I have to do this and I have to do that and I have to do this. And I say, well, listen. Question you have to ask yourself is this. Are you worthy, or rather, do you believe you're worthy of rest? Do you believe you're worthy of having rest? It's quite a simple question. But I believe that oftentimes we would kind of say, well, no, I'm not worthy of having rest. We kind of feel that somehow it's a good idea, somehow heroic, to push yourself, and kind of in a certain sense abuse your body to the point where you can't do anything more, and that's somehow a good thing. I would kind of challenge every single one of us to take a few moments, if you haven't done so, take a few moments, sit down, and ask yourself, as God has created me, a beautiful human being, God doesn't create garbage. Am I worthy or am I not worthy of rest? Is my body worthy or not worthy of rest? Second point would be this. Have some concrete idea what precisely you're going to do when you're going to rest. See, for the people of God in the Old Testament, what they typically did was Sabbath times, time of rest was a time for God, a time for family, and a time for yourself. What does it mean? Well, for most of us Catholics, it would mean that taking the time in the morning to go and worship the Lord, Sunday Mass, or Saturday evening, or Sunday night, but making sure that every week, I would take and consecrate that 1 hour, just 1 hour a week, not very long, 1 hour a week to God. Second, take time for your family. Oftentimes, we hear these stories or we click on them on Facebook, these kind of like beautiful, heart-wrenching stories of somebody who was a rich banker or something along those lines. We kind of know the stereotype. And he's lying in his deathbed and he starts crying and saying that, I wish I had spent more time with my family. And we kind of click on that and we give it a thumbs up, and we give it a little heart face or some emoji or something like that. But we don't necessarily realize that to some extent we're doing the same thing in our lives. Why? Because we don't have time for our family. Well, Sabbath rest is a time for God, like we mentioned, but also time for family. So we can kind of take that moment on Sunday to reconnect with our family. Maybe as something as simple as putting your arms around your sister, around your brother, mother, dad, siblings, maybe even putting your arm around your son or daughter, something you haven't done in a while, and saying, I appreciate you, I love you, just giving them a hug. Something very, very simple, but something that makes them know they're appreciated. And kind of third point for yourself. What does Sabbath rest mean for yourself? Sometimes we're kind of conditioned to think that doing anything for myself is bad. That's actually not the case. As we know, we need to do things for ourselves sometimes, otherwise we're going to experience burnout. What does it mean to enjoy Sabbath rest also for yourself? Well, it means that doing something you want to do, not something you have to do. For example, oftentimes we hear that one should not work, or rather do servile work on the Sabbath. one should not work outdoors or something like that. However, I would kind of have a little bit, not necessarily challenge, but challenge maybe way of thinking on that. For example, if somebody works 6 days a week without access to the outdoors, in a small cubicle working on a computer, perhaps for him, Sabbath rest would be doing some restful gardening, for example, on Sunday afternoon. However, on the flip side, if someone else works 6 days a week outdoors, farmer, making hay, perhaps Sabbath rest for him would be sitting in the cool shade reading a book. It all depends what I want to do rather than what I have to do. Just kind of final quick parting words. We heard there's 3 ways, that is, 3 specific ways I can dedicate myself in a certain sense, or rather give myself some Sabbath rest. First is God, second is family, and third is myself. Ideally, those 3 would kind of, in a certain sense, form a symbiotic relationship. However, it's also good to realize that number 1, in first place, there's God. Number 2, in second place, there's my family. And third, and last of all, there's myself. So let's begin praying in the words that Jesus taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Lord our God, we ask you to give us a renewed understanding of rest. Allow us to realize that we need rest for ourselves, for our family, and to, in a certain sense, realize that we are indeed worthy of rest. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
I'm very happy to present my greetings to Shalom Ministry and all the good work that you do around the world in fulfilling the dream of the Holy Father that all should hear the love of God. Thank you for your good work and those who support you. May these special days of new evangelization bless your operators, your administrators, and your benefactors. God bless you.
Shalom World, God's own channel.